My guest this evening is the accomplished author and historian, Mr. Phillip Nelson. Phil, thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Jason. I sure appreciate this opportunity to be with you.
As do I. Delighted to meet you, sir. We've just been acquainted by a crowdsourced community member, so this is really one of my favorite type of interviews. People out there in the crowdsourced community are watching the various stories that we discuss, and they share their knowledge with us and introduce me to you, and now we're having this interview. You are about to release a book about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm disappointed to say we didn't hear as much about it as might have been appropriate given his historical significance. It's a really terrible and tragic story, the assassination of Martin Luther King. He was a man with a tremendous message of peace and just a historical leader. What can you tell us, Philip, about what most people maybe don't realize about the assassination of Martin Luther King and how the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, may have been involved?
Well, yes, I'll be glad to do that. That's a lot of ground to cover, but we have to start somewhere. So let me just say that my book is the result of a survey of numerous other books. In fact, for the Martin Luther King assassination, you could just about say that I've read every one. And what I found when doing my initial research, and by the way, it's not all just a repeat of these other books or a comparison of them. There is much in the way of original discovery that we're going to be getting at in just shortly that supplement all of that, and I believe provides the final proofs that it really was a conspiracy, and there's I believe it's conclusively proven, but we'll let the reader decide.
Of course.
Now, as to those books, I quickly found that they fall into two categories, and the first three major books, the ones that really set the course for the future books, were written basically by three men who were very accomplished novelists. That is, they were gifted in the novelist approach to fiction writing, and that is the use of flowery language and soaring rhetoric and all that. Whereas the researchers who were doing the hard and fast research of really what happened, they wrote the books that were basically ignored by most of the investigators. In fact, you could argue all of the investigators. So let me just name those categories and mention some of the books that have been written by these fellows. In that first category, what I refer to as quasi or wholly fictional, the ones written by novelists that have been used, as the baseline. The very first one was William Bradford Huey, and he wrote. First of all, he wrote 3 Look articles, and two of them in November of 1968. A third one.
Look is a magazine.
Look is an old magazine that no longer exists.
Got it.
So like Life and Saturday Evening Post and Collier's, there were a number of older magazines that fell out of style, I guess, and were replaced by others like People magazine. So,
right.
Anyway, William Bradford Huey was first on the scene, and I believe I've shown with some degree of persuasion that he was set up by J. Edgar Hoover, Clyde Tolson, and their assistant director, Deke DeLuch. Cartha, his nickname was Deke. Deloach was the assistant director. They
Now,
basically,
Phil, may I pause you for a second? Because the gentleman that you're talking about, I want to make sure that our crowdsource audience here knows exactly who they are. J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was the director of the FBI. Clive Tolson was his sort of right-hand man, as it were. What was Clive Tolson's official role in the FBI?
he was known as the second in command, and he had the title of associate director.
But not the deputy director.
No, he wasn't. I don't believe he was called deputy, but he was the second in command, and he was more than just an associate director, a high official of the FBI. He was, you could say that he was so close to J. Edgar Hoover that they had a very deep personal relationship.
They were homosexual lovers, according to most.
I mean, that's the general gist of it. It was never proven with photographs that I know of or any other means, but it was pretty.
I do believe that Wayne Madsen has reported that someone had photographs of J. Edgar Hoover. I believe the term Wayne used was in flagrante delicto.
Yes, right. I've heard that as well. I haven't actually seen them, but yes, I've heard. And also that some of Meyer Lansky, for one, some of the mafiosa that had been, palling around with the same people.
And I bring this up because these are the same characters that play pivotal roles in a historical subject that is probably the one that I've studied the most, the assassination of JFK. And I want it to be clear to everyone who's watching that these are not isolated incidents. I believe very strongly, as I suspect you do from looking at the library of books that you've written, that these individuals were responsible for these events. They controlled the events, they directed the events, they covered the events up. And it's interesting because in addition to being the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, here in 2018, we're experiencing a shockingly similar level of corruption within the FBI today, covering up not murder, but possibly wide-scale treason within the United States government at the highest levels.
Yes, it's been a continuing story, and in the interim, there have been other scandals that have been muted and put on the back shelf. But there have been many in regard to, for instance, the FBI lab that had been so acclaimed for so many years. Suddenly, they found out about, I think in the early '90s it was, that it wasn't nearly quite as well run as it had been portrayed to be, and in fact, it caused them to have to start over in many respects with a lot of prosecutions and throw out certain cases completely. And that wasn't. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was back in the '60s, or it was actually what was exposed by the Church Committee,
right,
in 1975, and then in 1976 it was referred to the House. The House, certain people in the House were inspired enough to get legislation passed to examine the assassinations of both JFK and Martin Luther King.
And RFK as well, right? The House Select Committee on Assassinations?
No, it for some reason they thought at the time that had been pretty well settled, but because had captured Sirhan. Well, most people, most reasonably informed people now realize that is no more settled than either of these.
Right, and of course, in today's graphic, I've included images of each of the men, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson. So let me just take you back for a minute to this book that you were referring to by Mr. Huey here. It's called Did the FBI Kill Martin Luther King? And based on what you've led it with, I can only presume that he came to the conclusion that they did not?
Well, now this was a book he wrote in 1977.
Right.
And that was not his original work.
Okay.
His original book was written in 1970. In other words, he had written these articles, and he and that led up to him publishing this book in 1970 called He Slew the Dreamer. There it is. He Slew the Dreamer. Now the title of that book had been changed because when he originally contracted to write that on behalf of James Earl Ray, he was supposed to be writing James Earl Ray's story as dictated more or less by James Earl Ray. But along the way, that was just a come on. I don't think he ever intended to do that. I think he always had intended to write a book that would portray James Earl Ray as the sole assassin. But for the first two articles in Look magazine, he went along with it to an extent, even though he deeply implicated by association and by indirectly the fact that it was really what he portrayed as the fact that it was James Earl Ray who was the assassin, and he started denigrating Ray in the most savage ways, even as early as that first November the 12th, 1968 article in Look magazine.
And of course, Huey is no longer alive, so we can't really question him about any of this. Right. Yeah. He had written his narrative in such a way that it was. Well, I'll quote just a sentence. He said, "Born in 1928, this is the quote from his book, in dirt poor poverty in Southwest Illinois, he was a miserable, hungry, defiant youth, embarrassed by his ignorance, his appearance, and his odor." Now, that sort of goes to the heart of how he is characterizing this James Earl Ray. And James Earl Ray was, he was, you could say, ignorant, I suppose, because he was not well educated. He only had an 8th grade education, as I recall. But all of this, why would he portray his client in this fashion is beyond me. And the fact that he said he was born in Southwest Illinois, there's a lie right there. He was not born in Southwest Illinois. He was born in Alton, Illinois, and actually raised in and around Quincy, Illinois. And Quincy is a farther north than Springfield, Illinois, and Indianapolis, Indiana. It's not southwest, it's really northwest. That's where he was born. He was born right across the river from Hannibal, Missouri, which is where everyone knows Mark Twain's characters, the innocent and happy-go-lucky guys, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn.
Huckleberry Finn were raised. So it was within a few miles of them, and he's trying to portray Ray as being Southern so that he can then tag him as being a racist in the future. That's exactly what he did. I want to get back to the point I was going to make, though. Huey was just the first of a series. He was followed by other novelists, Gerald Frank and George Macmillan, in 1972 and in 1976. And then in future years, there was a whole series of other writers who took that same baton and carried it right into the last 5 decades. Gerald Posner was one. Hampton.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And he also wrote a book about Lee Harvey Oswald, Case Closed. So it's interesting to see how Gerald Posner, I've met him. He was a very polite guy, but I don't really believe his book.
Well, there have been many essays written, reviews that basically deconstructed his books point by point by point, and have proven that he was just on a mission. In other words, I think you can argue that all these names that I just mentioned there, back through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and as late as this year, 2018, there have been a series of books written by people who were on a mission, and the mission was to reinforce the original story as told by William Bradford Huey. Right. And what we're going to be doing shortly is to deconstruct Huey's arguments completely, and to show that he actually made up lies about the background of James Earl Ray that simply did not exist. And he referenced newspaper articles by saying things that they didn't say. In other words, he manufactured a whole story about how James Earl Ray had stalked Martin Luther King, and the fact is they were never in the same city together, with two minor exceptions. In Los Angeles, when Ray had already been there for 4 months, over 4 months, Dr. King flew into Los Angeles on, it was March the 16th of 1968. Well, on that very day, Ray was packing his bags in his car and ready to leave Los Angeles, and he left Los Angeles the very next day, a day and a half, or essentially 2 days before Martin Luther King did. So how can he be considered a stalker back then? Well, he can't be. That's the answer to that. And then the way he portrayed his trip across the South, the last 2 weeks before Kennedy was, Dr. King was murdered in Memphis, he tried to portray him as going there to stalk Martin Luther King. And there he was never in the same city, even though he said that they were. It was all a lie, and I proved that within the book by referencing Taylor Branch's book. Taylor Branch wrote a trilogy, 3 books that were very closely, followed Martin Luther King's entire, career. That is a truthful book. So you can go back and see that everything that Huey said was a lie, because you can contrast it to what is a known truth by a Pulitzer Prize winner of a biographer. And his case, Huey's case, falls apart.
So
anyway,
Phil, talk to us a little bit about some of the new revelations in your book, because it seems amazing that even 50 years on, it was just, I think, last year that I did a video in which Gerald Posner debated Roger Stone as to who killed JFK, and I agree with you. There are still people who are out there pushing this story, and the similarities between the assassination of JFK, RFK, and MLK are astounding. We've had Ole Damagard on the show many times, and Ole specializes in pointing out these sort of similarities in what are known as false flag events. And when I say false flag, of course, I don't mean to say that these individuals were not in fact killed, but rather they were killed and the death was blamed on someone who didn't actually do it. And the similarities, of course, would be it's one guy whose motive is he's crazy, and he kills the person, and the police get him right away, and he's either incarcerated right away or killed himself in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald. And we see this same sort of thing happening even today in the October 1st Las Vegas shooting. It really is like a template. And so what have you discovered that readers of Who Really Killed Martin Luther King Jr. can expect in terms of the case against Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, 2 individuals that figure prominently in each of these assassinations?
Okay, I want to do that. I want to first mention the books that are the truthful books, that
yes.
if someone wants to really understand it. And my book is built on a foundation of all of these books. And so I'm looking at the truthful books and recasting the story in a very truthful way, which are cited, all the citations go back to these truthful books. But against that, as in stark relief, a bas relief, I'm contrasting the lies of these other books. So all these books are referenced in one way or another within my book, but then I go beyond that, which I'll get to in just a moment. But the truthful books start with Dr. William F. Pepper. He has laid out a storyline that is just profoundly disturbing, but He's done it in 3 books over the last 30 years. He's written 3 books, one per decade, more or less. And his last book was, the plot to kill Dr. King, Martin Luther King, was just published in 2016, and that's precisely when I started my research, and that was the first book I read, and it just went from there. So anyway, that I can't say enough about his book, but there were other books that I also used for other points that he had not addressed, and I'll just name them off. John Avery Emerson was one. Mark Lane's classic book, written with Dick Gregory, was another. The book by Dr. Phillip Melanson, written in the late 70s, was another. Ethan Theoharis was still another. His books were in the 1990s. And Harold Weisberg. Harold Weisberg in 1970 wrote a book called Frame Up, which basically was really the most truthful book of that era. And guess what? The FBI ignored his book. The Department of Justice ignored his book, even though he had ties to the Senate. He was a Senate investigator. They knew Harold Weisberg. Everybody did that. But even the House Select Committee on Assassinations essentially ignored Weisberg, and they repeatedly referenced. In some cases, you'll see 12 citations on a single page of the House Select Committee report back to this William Bradford Huey, and his book was full of lies, and that's what I want to get to. Now you asked about what a central point that I wanted to get to related to how Huey had portrayed that trip across the South. When he left Los Angeles on March the 17th, he was told by his handler, a fellow named Raoul, to meet him in New Orleans on March the 21st. So he drove like crazy. It's a 2,000-mile trip from Los Angeles to New Orleans. And that means he had 4 days, 500 miles per day. And the interstate highway system wasn't as complete as it is today. So that made it even more of a hassle to get across there in 4 days. But he got there very late on March the 21st. And when he called the number he was supposed to call to talk to Raoul, an intermediary answered the phone and advised him that Raoul had decided to go on to Birmingham, and he left a message to convey to James Earl Ray that he needed to drive on to Birmingham, another 400 miles. So the next day, March the 22nd, Ray set out for Birmingham, but it was a stormy day throughout that entire area. More on that in a few minutes, but believe me, it was just a humongous storm that delivered a 17-inch blizzard in Memphis.
Wow.
That's a very key part of the story I'm going to be getting to. I'll get back to that. But the point is, that storm was a huge storm throughout the area. So here it was on March 22nd. He had already driven 300 miles when he got to Selma, Alabama. And at that point, here he had driven 2,300 miles altogether. And he was very tired. It was turning dark. It was storming like crazy. And so he decided on a lark, on the spur of the moment, to just stop it and spend the night at the Flamingo Hotel in downtown Selma. Now, sometime later, he explained that to his attorney, Arthur Haynes, and Haynes told the story to William Bradford Huey. They had this contractual relationship all set up so that Huey could get all these facts directly from Haynes. What Huey did, though, with that information was to turn it around and try to portray Ray's trip to Selma not to New Orleans, and this spontaneous stop in Selma on his way to Birmingham. He wanted to turn that the fact that he had stayed overnight in Selma as to the centerpiece of his trip. It was always just a happenstance because of this long drive he had just been making, and the fact that he got there, he was tired and worn out, and it was a stormy night, so he slept there for the night.
It's not a particularly amazing looking hotel. It's not like Disney World or something.
It's not. It's got a fancy name, I guess. So anyway, next morning he gets up, drives on to Birmingham to meet Raoul. It's 100 miles away, so he was in good. I mean, he had the time to do that. He wasn't going to meet Raoul until around noon anyway, so he had the time. So that's all it was. It was just a stop for the night so he could rest and sleep. Okay. We'll be coming back to that, I guess, because that's a crucial part of the story. Because the point again is that Huey wanted to turn that stop around and make that the centerpiece. He even lied about a New Orleans newspaper that Ray might have seen on March 21st in New Orleans, and what he said was that newspaper article stated that Dr. King was supposed to be in Selma that day, in or near Selma. Well, that was a complete lie. He had never planned to be in Selma that day. He was planned to be in Memphis, as I mentioned before. But the trip had to be canceled because there were no flights in or out of Memphis. They had 17 inches of snow on the ground, including runways.
Right.
And it was a very significant, very freak storm. It was the first day of spring after all, and we're talking about Memphis.
It's not a city where they're prepared to deal with snow at the airport.
Precisely. They probably didn't have snow plows. Well, I'm sure they had some, but
maybe not at an airport like that.
It's not like how many snow plows they have in.
It's not Chicago,
Minneapolis, for example, or Milwaukee.
Right.
Okay. So the point is, he was never ever scheduled to go to Memphis, to Selma. He was scheduled to go to Memphis. Yet Huey put it in his book, in those articles, in that last article, and then in his book, he actually published this bald-faced lie. And it wasn't just an inadvertent slippage. It had to be part of his mission, and that is the key point. What other reason would he have to make up something like that and to state a bald-faced lie in his book, which is provably incorrect? So I was able to prove that because of something called the internet, something you could never
heard of it.
Okay, and so he was relying on the fact that since his book was published 2 years after the fact, that no one was going to, go out into a library somewhere or the newspaper and look through old pages of newspaper to see if exactly what that article said.
Right.
Well, I was able to do it quite easily in about 8 minutes, on the internet. And so I looked at the article, and there was only one article in that entire newspaper that he said was dated March 21st, 1968, and it was back on page 58.
What was the name of the paper?
It was the New Orleans Times-Picayune. And so I looked at the article, and I read it, and I reread it, and I could not believe it, but there was no mention of Selma or anywhere around Selma, Alabama. And the only subject of the article was it was about how Dr. King had been in Mississippi and how he was planning to then return to Atlanta from Mississippi, which is exactly what he did. On the 21st, he returned to Atlanta and spent the night there because that's where he was when Reverend Lawson called him from Memphis the next morning, March 22nd, and told him, you got to cancel the trip. There are no airplanes coming in here today. So he canceled the trip and rescheduled it for March the 28th. Okay, and we'll get to that later too. and again, the point is that Huey was taking this completely untrue statement and trying to portray a story that did not exist. And that wasn't the only time. That was the first major trip down that lane. So anyway, getting back to the story, after or when Ray went on to Birmingham and he met Raul, they together drove from Birmingham to Atlanta. And that comes right out of Ray's own book. And anyway, what happened there was they rented a rooming house, a room in a rooming house, down in downtown, sort of right out of downtown Atlanta. And the next day, Raul went on to Miami to purportedly to do more negotiations for these gun smugglers, and they were planning supposedly to furnish these gun smugglers a model of a rifle, and that they were going to meet them in Memphis. So they went to after that, when Raul returned from Miami, the two of them got in the Mustang and drove back to Birmingham. This was on March the 28th. By the way,
interesting. I recall that he drove a Mustang. Is that a significant detail?
it is because it was a year-old Mustang that Raul gave him $2,000 cash for, and that was quite a lot of money for a car back then.
Right.
And so he bought this car for $2,000. It was a one-year-old car, and it had very low mileage on it. And somehow this guy who had no other means of support was able to buy the new car, new cameras, good quality cameras and other photographic equipment. He took dance lessons in Los Angeles. He took bartending lessons. He went to a plastic surgeon to get the point of his nose rounded out.
Wow.
So he was trying to disguise himself, and he had all these aliases he was using. So he was trying to avoid capture as a runaway fugitive. He had been sprung out of prison. Yeah, that's it. It's actually a very pale yellow Mustang.
Still looks new.
It was referred to as almost being white. Now that is actually in the museum, and I don't think that is the exact car. I'm not.
Actually, it does say that it is the actual car driven.
Oh, it is. Okay. Okay, well then that's it. And anyway, they left Atlanta on March the 28th. And by the way, Dr. King was in New York. Well, no, he had been in New York, and then he came back to Memphis on March the 28th, and he was sabotaged by the FBI. The FBI had all kinds of informants there. They had brought in these thugs from St. Louis and Chicago to make sure that King's march down there on that day, March 28th, was a disaster, and it was. They started these guys started breaking windows and rioting and beating up people, and the upshot was that one of them was actually killed by the police, and there was National Guard called out to quell the rioting and so forth. It was a huge mess. But the FBI had set that up, and they also had set up Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia to give a speech on the Senate floor the very next day. We're talking about a 2,800 page or 2,800 word speech that had all the earmarks of an FBI written document.
Now, Phil, may I interject?
The Black Messiah. Yeah.
May I interject, Phil? Senator Robert Byrd was a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes,
And
he was.
towards the end of his life, he renounced the Klan, but of course, he's quite a despicable figure who was involved in numerous hateful activities. And I believe Hillary Clinton has said that he was a mentor, and she's even been photographed with him and gave a eulogy or something at his funeral, if I'm not mistaken, or a eulogy by video.
Yes, she has said very nice things about him, and of course he was a senator right up until, I believe, until his death in 2010.
Yes.
It looks like.
And it's an
Now
interesting.
he did resign. Now there he is, in his.
They're such good friends.
Oh yeah, wow, you're right on top of all this. He had. He looks fairly old there. I think that he was in the Ku Klux Klan well into his 60s or something. But I don't know exactly when he resigned from it. It may have been right after the murder of King. He probably wanted to take a more discreet role after that, because that's exactly what happened. Just a week after that commotion down there is when King was killed in Memphis. When he came back, he had come back basically because he felt he had to prove that he could run a protest march that did not become violent. His whole thing was nonviolence, and so when the FBI sabotaged him and had all these people come in and create violence, it was for the very purpose of embarrassing him and forcing him to go back there and prove that he could actually do this without the march turning violent. And it worked. Not only did it work in that respect, but it also embarrassed him by publicizing the fact that he stayed at one of the more posh hotels there called the Holiday Inn Rivermont. And they embarrassed him by saying, most people, would stay at the Negro-owned Lorraine Motel, and sure enough, that's where he wound up staying. And when he went there, just before he arrived, his reservations were changed, interestingly, at the last minute, and so instead of a room on the first floor in the interior of the building, he was moved out to this room 306 where the balcony is, and where these fellows are all pointing up at a direction that they were told to point to. And so that photograph was basically staged, because they're not pointing where the shot really came from.
But aren't these Martin Luther King's associates, and isn't this him dead right here?
Well, there are two men up there who in that photograph, and one of them is Jesse Jackson, and the other one is Reverend Billy Kyles, and both of them were informants.
Wow.
That
so
they were.
Jesse Jackson was working for the FBI against Martin Luther King? That's shocking.
Well, that's all factual, and it comes from not just me, not just Dr. William Pepper, but go on YouTube and there's a video. I think it's called basically Jesse Jackson was involved in the murder of Martin Luther King, or killed Martin, something along those lines. I could probably get that reference for you in a minute, but you could get to it by referencing Billy Kyles or Steve Coakley, Cokeley, or Dick Gregory.
Gregory.
They made some videos together that'll blow your socks off.
Oh yeah, well Dick Gregory was a good guy. He was.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he was until his dying day. He was trying to get to the bottom of what really happened there. I'm just sorry that he died before he could read my book, because
he died only recently, didn't he?
I think it was about 6 months ago.
Yeah, and also it's worth noting that Dick Gregory was on, I think it's called Good Night America with Geraldo Rivera, where my friend Robert Grodin revealed the Zapruder film for the first time ever to the public in 1975. Dick Gregory and Geraldo Rivera were there.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was on Geraldo's show, actually, where that was done.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. I know you've got a lot to say about this, but I want to try to bring us around to talking about some of the through lines here in terms of Lyndon Johnson. And we know that George H.W. Bush was a CIA officer, operative, something, agent at the time. Was there any evidence, or is there any evidence to indicate any involvement of George Herbert Walker Bush? We've seen a lot of documents, and there's a wire or a telegram from J. Edgar Hoover referencing George Bush of the CIA in relation to the JFK assassination. Is there anything that ties Herbert Walker Bush to the Martin Luther King assassination?
I have not seen anything that ties Bush to this one, but I'm familiar with what you're referring to in reference to the JFK assassination. But I want to explain something about Lyndon Johnson's purported role. The book goes into a lot of detail, and this part of the book comes from that author, John Avery Emerson, that I referenced before, one of the truth-seeking authors, as opposed to that other group.
Right.
But Emerson went into a lot of methodical detail referencing Johnson's ties to the governor of Tennessee at the time. His name was Buford Ellington. And in fact, Buford Ellington had been the governor up to about 1966, I believe, for a term. And then he went to Washington to work for Johnson, essentially, but he had a title. He was head of one of the emergency services. It wasn't FEMA, but it was something. And then he went back to Tennessee and ran for governor again. So he was there. He was in Washington working alongside Johnson and Hoover during this critical time period of 66, 67. Okay, then he goes back to Tennessee. Okay, so they are very close. As a matter of fact, one of Ellington's senior staff members said that it was amazingly close, or words to that effect. That's not a quote, but it was something that he said. It's something to behold. I remember that. And he would often go to D.C. when he was the governor, and he had an automatic pass to stay overnight there in the Lincoln bedroom.
Wow.
He would go to Johnson's ranch often and either bird hunting or deer hunting or whatever hunting they were doing down. They were very close, in other words. And that is a sign. Whenever someone got that close to Johnson, it was for Johnson's purposes in manipulating him and doing it on a personal level and not having a written record of it. That's just the way he worked. And I'm not making that stuff up either. That's in Robert Caro's books. And as a matter of fact, he preferred in some of his most confidential, in other words, his most unethical or illegal or unconstitutional actions. It was always that way. He wanted person to person, eyeball to eyeball kind of a contact. And in some of his conversations, he would have a telephone conversation, but only if he knew that there was no chance those lines were tapped. And none of this would ever be reduced to writing. So, to expect to see a written record of any of these communications.
Now, Phil, can I ask you about? I've heard that Lyndon Johnson was posthumously convicted after his death. There was some trial. I believe it was conspiracy to commit murder that he was convicted of. Do you know anything about that?
Well, yes. Now that was the findings of a grand jury in 1984 in Franklin County, Texas. And it had to do with a fellow who I've written about. In fact, the first chapter of my second book, LBJ From Mastermind to the Colossus, is a lengthy chapter that goes into that in excruciating detail. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that it goes back to the 1961 murder of Henry Marshall, who was an extension agent, I think you'd call him, for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Uh-huh.
And Marshall had found a number of problems with the enterprise that was being run down there by Billy Saul Estes.
Yes.
And basically, Billy Saul Estes was he had gotten in cahoots with Johnson basically to make a lot of money, and that's exactly what happened. They made a ton of money, all basically millions of dollars, which were different kinds of fraud in the U.S. government, i.e. the U.S. taxpayer. And the way they were able to do that, one of them was called the allotments, the cotton allotments, mm-hmm. that were given when the government took over subsidizing the commodity of cotton, and basically through price supports of, a higher than market level price support is all I can think of saying about that. Right. But in exchange for doing that for the farmers, cotton farmers, they had to agree not to put any more land, in the production of cotton than they were allotted originally. Mm-hmm. Okay, there was a way though that they could get around that if the government took over some of the land by eminent domain. Uh-huh. Then they could take the allotments of that particular acreage and reapply it to some other acreage, mm-hmm. Under very strict rules. Okay, well, they started bending these rules. That is, Johnson and Billy Saul Estes started bending rules left and right, and now and again, this is only one of their ways that they were scamming the government. There were others through, I'll just reduce it to say, through the sales of bogus fertilizer tanks. Okay, they claimed that they had thousands of these fertilizer tanks, but in fact there were probably only 10% of that, 5% probably but they had set it up so that they had fake serial numbers that they used to get for the farmers to get mortgages to buy these tanks, and that was just another scheme of theirs. So there were others, but those were the primary ones.
There was loads of scheming going on with Lyndon Johnson and his various cohorts. I was just briefly showing a book called Blood, Money, and Power. And this is a book, I've read this book, it's very interesting. It's written by a guy named Barr McClellan, who was an attorney with a law firm that represented Johnson in the 50s and 60s. And Barr McClellan ultimately left that law firm and sued the law firm because the law firm kept compelling him, as a lawyer, to do things that were illegal. And Barr McClellan is a very, in my view, pivotal figure in what we now know about the JFK assassination, because Barr McClellan was aware of a murder case that took place in 1951, where a very close Johnson associate named Malcolm Wallace had shot a guy in his office on a golf course just in the middle of the day, walked in and shot this guy, killed him. And in 1951, criminals who were convicted of murder in Texas, something like 90% of them got the death penalty, which I think was the electric chair at the time. About 10% got life in prison due to extenuating circumstances, and this one individual, Malcolm Wallace, got a suspended sentence, served no time in prison. And his fingerprint from that gun was classified by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And now, in the early 2000s, Barr McClellan, who was aware of the facts and details of that murder case, through a FOIA request, obtained that fingerprint from the 1951 murder and compared it to an unknown fingerprint, what Jim Garrison described as the fingerprint of an unknown subject that was extracted from the 6th floor of the book depository on November 22nd, 1963. They found in the book depository, according to Jim Garrison, the fingerprints of Lee Harvey Oswald, various employees of the Texas School Book Depository, members of the Dallas Police, and this one unknown subject who in the early 2000s, an FBI fingerprint analyst at the behest of Mr. McClellan said was an A+ match for Malcolm Wallace. So basically physical evidence placing Malcolm Wallace on the 6th floor of the book depository. And this was not an individual who was employed by the book depository, but someone who is linked to numerous crimes that are linked to Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, I've covered that story in minute detail as well in my very first book, LBJ, the Mastermind of the JFK Assassination. Other people have written, tried to retract some of that recently, and let's just say it was a failed effort because there's abundant proof that it was his fingerprint. There's no question about it. And there's a document written by a friend of mine named David Denton, and it's findable on the internet. It's just put his name, David Denton, Denton, and the title of his essay is Nexus Redux. Okay, and it's a rather lengthy. It's a 25-page document, but he goes over all the details, the nuts and bolts, and proves that in fact that story has not been rebutted in the way that a recent book thought it did.
Well, I would also add, sorry to interrupt, but I would add to that comment that our mutual friend, Mr. Posner, is one of the individuals who has attempted to rebut that. And he speaks about that in the video on the original Crowdsource the Truth YouTube channel called Stone versus Posner, Who Killed JFK? Mr. Posner makes the case that that's not conclusive evidence, but you and I seem to be in agreement that we disagree with Mr. Posner. It's very damning evidence that Malcolm Wallace was on the 6th floor of the school book depository.
Yes, and the author of the book that I referred to, Joan Mellon, is in the title of that, in the subtitle of that paper that you brought up.
I see that.
And yes, this is a very compelling, I would say it's a bulletproof document that really can't be denied.
Prima facie evidence, if you would.
Yes, I think so. And it's rather detailed. As I say, it's a 25-page document, but I think it's the final word on this subject, and it proves, to the nth degree that the story that you just repeated, it was true, it is true, and it always will be true. Now, I just wanted to follow up on that business with Henry Marshall.
Yes.
Because what happened in 1962, Clint Peoples, the Texas Ranger who was investigating Mac Wallace's possible involvement in a series of murders, had called the grand jury at that point in 1962. What happened, though, is that another of Johnson's sycophants down in Texas, a U.S. attorney at the time, and his name was Barefoot Sanders. Now, Barefoot was his actual family name. It was an inherited name or something in the family, so it wasn't just a nickname. But his full name was Harold Barefoot Sanders. He was a U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Texas. He had somehow ingratiated himself into this this Texas grand jury that Clint Peoples was trying to conduct down in Franklin, Texas. It was out of his territory, but somehow he got down there and took over that grand jury, and basically ensured that that grand jury would not get all of the records that they had demanded. In other words, they wanted the full set of records, several hundred pages of records that this Henry Marshall had compiled in his files, and they could not allow that because it would have surely implicated Lyndon Johnson and Billy Celestis in this series of frauds. So he was able to somehow short circuit that investigation, that grand jury, and basically therefore did not get the cause of death changed for Henry Marshall. Instead of an obvious homicide, it continued to be considered a suicide. The
Right.
absurdity of that is just beyond belief. The guy was alleged to have taken a long rifle, a bolt-action rifle, okay, and held it such that the rifle was pointed right at his chest, and he fired it 5 times into his chest.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow, could
Three-
you do that? Bolt action.
A bolt action, so you had to actually come back,
Recycle it each time.
so forth, and move it around like this, and do it again, and then to do the whole thing again 5 times.
That coroner
and-
could get a job in Arkansas or Las Vegas.
Yeah, Arkansas would right around Mena there somewhere.
Right.
But it was so absurd that it was never a realistic chance that he tried to commit suicide. There were all kinds of other inconsistencies and anomalies that would have precluded any rational person to ever think that it was a suicide. But anyway,
So Phil,
So-
you've got
so-
extensive information about the crimes of Lyndon Johnson. Of course, we've heard, I believe even Robert McNamara ultimately admitted that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was staged in order to create a pretext for the United States to enter the war in Vietnam, and that Lyndon Johnson gave the orders to do that. Is that correct?
well, he did admit that the fog of war, that's his favorite term,
Right.
caused them to make, miscalculations and so forth. I don't think that he ever admitted that it was staged, but it was. I mean,
Right.
that's exactly what happened, as I've proven in my own books. In other words, my second book, LBJ From Mastermind to the Colossus, was all about Johnson's time in office and as a president. Yes, that one. And that covers all of these other things. I just mentioned this whole trial that Texas Ranger, then later on U.S. Marshal Clint Peoples was involved with. The whole chapter 1 is all about that. It's a lengthy chapter, but it goes into every conceivable detail about that whole deal. And then from there it goes on, and there are other murders that had been attributed to Johnson as well, and we go through all of those. And then there's the Vietnam War, of course, and that was his first major false flag, and it set the baseline for how he would involve the U.S. military in wars around the world. So that was done in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin charade, and then so in 1967. This Remember the Liberty incident, almost sunk by treason on the high seas, is the name of that book, Remember the Liberty.
Right.
And it goes into excruciating detail on that. Now,
Well, let me pause you there for a second, because this is a topic that's come up quite a lot. I didn't know anything about this USS Liberty attack until I got involved in independent news on the internet. And I also have experienced very little discrimination as a Jewish person in my life until I got involved with news on the internet. But there seems to be a really focused group of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel individuals who are convinced that Israel in 1967, a tiny country that financially, militarily, and diplomatically was very dependent on the United States, for some inexplicable reason, other than that they think that Israel is evil, would attack this U.S. ship. Now, what's the conclusion that you draw in this book? Because for the first time ever, I think last week, Field McConnell came on our show and said that Lyndon Johnson was the mastermind of the false flag to attack the USS Liberty, and that Lyndon Johnson instructed the military leaders of Israel to instruct their pilots to attack that ship, because Johnson wanted to draw the United States into that war in the Middle East. And just before you answer, to me, that makes more sense than Israel doing it, because I don't see any strategic advantage to Israel attacking the United States. I guess the argument is it would draw the United States into the war with Egypt, but hadn't Israel essentially defeated Egypt at that point? Why would they do that?
Well, yeah, that is the grand mystery. But in my own opinion, and I think I've laid out a pretty compelling case in this book, that piece of it, of the planning for the 6-day war, they didn't know it was going to be just 6 days. They knew it was going to be short, though. But the idea for that war, the original idea, obviously was something that Israel had been interested in for some time, and they, I believe, came to the table, well, Johnson's table in the Oval Office, and basically, I think an agreement was reached somewhere in 1965, as far back as 1965, could have been in 64, but the point is, there was a long history of actions that have been documented within the book that began in 1965 and continued into 66 and into 67. And so it wasn't just a spontaneous war; it was a very well planned war. Mm-hmm. Now the attack on the Liberty. I don't think that there was a significant reason that you could say that Israel really conceived that part of it. I think that came from Johnson. Now some people would argue with that, and they would say, yes, but if Israel wanted to attack this ship, it would, and blame it on Egypt, then that would be the pretext for the United States military to join them in their fight, to expand their territories and to defeat their enemies and the close by enemies. Okay, you could understand that, except that. And so therefore, if you assume that there was a 50-50 understanding that was going to be the deal, okay, for 2 years, and all the planning was related to that, that's one thing. But when Israel, for some reason, just couldn't hold back, they were supposed to start the war on June the 15th, 1967. In fact, that was conveyed in the title of the operation. It was called Frontlet 615. 615 means June the 15th, and it was so important to the mission that they put it right in the title of the operation.
Right.
It was a secret operation. No one outside of the Oval Office and what was called the 303 Committee, which was the same thing essentially as the National Security Council is now. It was run by Walt Rostow. Mm-hmm. It was essentially Johnson's national security expert. But the members of it included just Richard Helms, who was the head of the CIA at that time. Wow. And several others. There were five or six, some from the State Department and so forth. Anyway, if that had been a 50-50 understanding all that time, when Israel decided to go ahead and start the attack on 10 days earlier than the long-standing plan had been, well, then that should have put the kibosh on the attack, because it was imperative that the attack be on the first day of the war so that they could still blame Egypt. 4 days later, how can they now blame Egypt for the attack when the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the first day of the war? It became absurd. And I think Israel not only knew that and were basically trying to avoid the attack, or might have been. I know that there were some generals there who wanted to avoid the attack completely, and there were some arguments about that amongst the generals.
Israeli generals or U.S. generals?
No, Israeli generals. In fact, the father of Miko Peled, do you know him?
I don't know that much about this at all. I don't know Nico Peled.
Okay, Miko Peled is well, you should
We
check
could
him
do
out.
another show about this. This is obviously a deep topic. I bring it up only because I'm constantly accused of being a Zionist, of being a Mossad agent, and I'm just a guy trying to learn all these facts and details. I do happen to know that Lyndon Johnson is quite possibly the greatest traitor in American history. We're going to probably need to have another conversation in the near future, Phil, because I'm fascinated by the things that you're telling me, and there's so much more for us to discuss. I'm showing right now a photograph of this individual, a guy by the name of Albert Thompson, who is depicted here on Air Force One as Lyndon Johnson is being sworn in. And of course, he is the infamous wink man who is winking at Mr. Johnson there, seemingly in approval of the assassination of John Kennedy. And if I'm not mistaken, this guy was a senator or a lobbyist or somehow involved with Brown and Root. Is that correct?
Yes, but his name is Thomas, Albert Thomas.
Sorry.
And he was a congressman of long-standing, so he was, one of many sycophants for Lyndon Johnson, and that's a very sinister picture there. That you don't know what to make of it, but it's pretty clear that Johnson is winking back at him there. You can't exactly see that, but you can see the side of his face if you go real, in
yes,
close.
He seems like he's smiling, and it's always been my interpretation of this photograph because of the influence that Mr. Thomas had with Brown and Root, which of course became Kellogg, Brown and Root, which ultimately became Halliburton, KBR, clients of one of my friends, Dean Fougere, who seems to be working for the deep state rather than fighting it. But this individual seems to be winking with a sense of satisfaction that their plans will move forward to engage in the Vietnam War, which Brown and Root would profit extensively from by providing various services to the U.S. military. So again, when I hear an explanation of something like the attack on the Liberty, which at first blush made no sense to me, but when I hear an explanation that brings in Lyndon Johnson, and the motive could be war in the Middle East, when we know that Lyndon Johnson is very involved with Texas oilmen, that one of the reasons why it is speculated, one of the reasons why JFK may have been assassinated was his desire to eliminate the oil depletion allowance, which would have cost Texas oil millionaires tons of money. And after the assassination of JFK, those Texas oil millionaires have become oil billionaires. And of course, shortly after the presidency of Lyndon Johnson under Richard Nixon, we had the elimination of the gold standard and the move toward the petrodollar, which puts the entire value of the U.S. economy on the demand for the universally desired commodity of oil. So I think war in the Middle East was a motive for Mr. Johnson. Killing wantonly for his own personal gain is a clearly defined motive of Mr. Johnson, and it starts to make some more sense when we look at the facts and details through this lens.
Well, let me just add to that premise that he knew that in 1964, just 3 years earlier, that his little gamut back at the Gulf of Tonkin, his first major false flag operation worked
Right.
because he was elected in a landslide election, and he was he had a very fragile ego, very big but fragile ego, and he couldn't stand the chance of the thought of possibly losing the election in 1968. So in 1967, he was still intending to run, and he was using this as, I believe, as a pretext for coming to the aid of little Israel, as he used to say, and helping them out, and thereby, getting another landslide election. Because if he went into this war with Israel, and Israel was, was able to meet its objectives, his objective was, to gin up the patriotic fervor, as it were, because he knew that he was heading into a very difficult time. He had just lost he didn't lose, but he didn't win by much, the New Hampshire primary.
Right.
In February or late February of 1967, and he only won by about 4 points, as I recall. And Eugene McCarthy was, almost beat him in that first primary.
Right.
I was a student in Wisconsin in that year, and I know that Wisconsin was coming up next in the primary, and the McCarthy kids, I was one of them, had hit every house in the state with, trying to appeal to people to vote for McCarthy and, against Johnson. And the only thing that had changed was that Robert Kennedy, having seen what happened in New Hampshire, had also put his hat in the ring. So there was, so one of the reasons that Johnson decided to bow out on March the 31st of 1968 was, he was afraid of losing that election, and
right.
What happened was exactly what he had feared the most, that he was not going to be able to win. The reason that he did what he did in the Liberty attack, I believe, was to, firm up his support again, especially with Jewish people, and especially in New York and L.A. and Chicago, all the big cities. And that had to be part and parcel of his rationale for doing what he did. Now, what I was getting at earlier, in reference to why I believe Israel had resisted that, and I think it was something that he wanted to carry out.
Johnson wanted to carry out, and Israel wanted to resist it.
He was still pressing for the attack to take place, and this was 4 days into the war. That it would be ridiculous and impossible to really put the blame back on Egypt, and Israel understood that, and that's the reason they were dragging their feet. I think the fact they went to war 10 days early was part of their resistance, and I think that the other thing is that they had 3 torpedo boats, and they had fired 4 torpedoes at the Liberty, and for some reason every single one of them missed. The point here is that and those first 4 torpedoes, had they really wanted to sink the Liberty, there was nothing to prevent them from getting as close to the ship as necessary to guarantee that those 4 torpedoes would have hit. Well, none of them hit. The story that happened after that, this is all covered in my book on the Liberty, is that one of the sailors who was so injured from the attack, he almost died, and he would have had another sailor not come up to him and help hold his intestines in his abdomen, okay, and got him into the medics, and so that they were able to save his life, and by sewing him up right then.
Wow.
Anyway, he then had to go through this thing where the Navy was trying to say that he wasn't even on the Liberty. They tried
And
to
you've
deny.
interviewed these survivors of the
Oh
tragedy,
yeah,
right?
oh yeah. This guy was interviewed. His name is Larry Weaver, and he's on YouTube. You can find him too.
Wow.
He then hired an investigator to prove that he was really on the Liberty. He had to go to the expense of doing that so that he would get his disability.
Wow.
And so the point is that his investigator then told him that what he found out was that that fifth torpedo, the one that actually hit the Liberty, was not fired by Israel at all. That it was fired from a U.S. submarine on the order of Lyndon Johnson to fire the torpedo at his own ship.
Wow.
And that is what caused him to put this huge cover up. Every man, not just on the Liberty, but on all the ships that were involved in any way in coming to the rescue of the Liberty or whatever, anybody who was involved was given warnings. You can never talk to anybody about this. Not your wife, not your mother, not your father, nobody. That's who you talk to, nobody. And they were also separated and moved to different posts around the world so that no two of them would be together. So they couldn't even commiserate together on what had just occurred to them. Many of them were well, there were 34 who were killed.
Yeah.
There were 174 who were physically injured, and all of them had some degree of PTSD.
It's a shocking story.
But they couldn't talk to anybody about it, and so for years, for about 12 years, no one said anything.
Wow.
And then one of them wrote a book. That was James Ennis. And then other books followed, and more people got to become familiar with it. And to this day, however, most people, if you go out on the street, anywhere,
most people don't know about it. I had never heard of it until very recently.
Right. Ask 100 people, do you know anything about the attack on the Liberty? You're going to get a stare, like you have two heads or something.
And that's why I get concerned when I hear people who I know have lied about many other things, spreading information about this around the internet. Phil, I'm really pleased to have met you. You're a fascinating man. Your new book, of course, is called Who Really Killed Martin Luther King Jr., and it details your case against Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. The 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King was just yesterday, April 4th, 2018. And the book, of course, will be available in the coming days. People can get it on Amazon or other book retailers, perhaps, that are not controlled by the CIA. I want to thank you for joining me today, Phil, and I hope you'll come back and join me in the future to talk about some more of this. It's very fascinating. Is there anything else you wanted to share with our viewers before we wrap it up?
Just that the book is available now for pre-order on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and Books A Million and so forth. It'll be in bookstores also, hopefully, at least the few that are remaining. Other bookstores.
Not too many bookstores left.
But the publication date is April the 17th. It had to be delayed because of other problems for some reason. But it was supposed to be out yesterday. So anyway, it is now going to be published on April the 17th. And, you can either wait until then or you can pre-order and it will be ready for delivery on or about that day.
There you go. And hopefully people will do that and learn more about who actually... Yes.
Yes, Jason. I just wanted to say thank you to you for offering me the opportunity to appear on your show.
It's my pleasure, Phil.
There are so many details to all these things, and we've really covered a lot of territory here.
Yes. Well, I look forward to having you back on. Once again, Who Really Killed Martin Luther King Jr., the case against Lyndon B. Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. People can read that book and learn some more about one of the most sinister cover-ups in the history of our country. My guest is Philip Nelson. I want to thank Philip. I want to thank everyone for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you.